When the American colonies rose up against Britain in 1775, they expected their northern neighbors to do the same. Letters were sent, envoys dispatched, and even troops marched into Quebec, all in the name of shared freedom. But Canada said no. While America burned for independence, Canada chose loyalty, faith, and survival. This is the untold story of why Canada refused to join the American Revolution. In 1775, while the 13 American colonies prepared to fight the British Empire, they made one bold assumption: that Canada would join them. To the revolutionaries, it seemed obvious. They called the Canadians their northern brethren, sent them letters promising liberty, trade, and a shared destiny. The Continental Congress even passed a resolution inviting Quebec to send delegates to Philadelphia. On paper, it was unity. In reality, it was tone-deaf. Canada didn't see the Americans as freedom fighters. Quebec, still reeling from being conquered by Britain in 1763, was a French Catholic society surrounded by Protestant empires. To them, the American Rebellion wasn't liberation. It was another invasion waiting to happen. Most Canadians had lived through the fall of New France and knew exactly who the Northern Brethren were, the same colonists who had celebrated their defeat 20 years earlier. The call for unity rang hollow. When the Americans sent pamphlets north, written in broken French and filled with talk of natural rights, Quebec's priests laughed them off. To French-speaking Catholics, liberty sounded suspiciously Protestant. The word republic carried the scent of heresy. Britain might have been a conqueror, but it was a predictable one. The Americans were fanatics with muskets and sermons. Benjamin Franklin himself was sent to Quebec in 1776 to fix the mistake. He arrived in the dead of winter, armed with letters, charm, and diplomatic genius, and found doors closing everywhere he went. Franklin, then nearly 70, trudged through the cold to plead with Canadian merchants and priests. No one listened. He offered alliance, trade, and the friendship of a free America. The answer was a polite no. His mission failed so completely that his hosts refused even to attend his farewell dinner. By spring, he was back across the border, humiliated and half-frozen. Washington didn't wait for politics to work. That same winter, he sent troops. Generals Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold led 1,100 men north toward Montreal and Quebec City. The plan was simple: take Canada by force and free its people whether they wanted it or not. The reality was brutal. The soldiers marched through freezing blizzards, half-starved, dragging cannons through forests and frozen rivers. They expected locals to rise up against the British. No one did. By December 1775, the American army surrounded Quebec City. Montgomery wrote letters predicting a quick victory. The attack came on New Year's Eve and ended in disaster. A snowstorm blinded the troops, gunpowder froze solid, and the defenders knew every street. Montgomery was killed by a single cannon blast. Benedict Arnold took a musket shot to the leg and collapsed in the snow. The rest of the army scattered or surrendered. When dawn broke, British flags still flew over Quebec. Church bells rang through the city as priests led prayers of thanksgiving. What Washington had imagined as a triumph turned into humiliation. His first northern campaign was over before the United States even officially existed. To Canadians, the revolution wasn't a call for freedom. It was a foreign invasion, and they had repelled it with snow, faith, and stubbornness. There was another reason they'd stayed loyal, one the Americans never understood: the Quebec Act of 1774. Just a year before the revolution began, Britain had passed a law that changed everything. It guaranteed the right to practice Catholicism, preserved French civil law, and recognized property rights from before the conquest. To Americans, it was an outrage. They called it one of the intolerable acts, proof that the king favored papists over Protestants. To Canadians, it was salvation. For the first time in history, a Protestant empire had legalized Catholic worship. It was an act of tolerance that the American colonies had never offered. Priests preached sermons calling the British king the protector of faith. In Quebec City, the church became an unofficial extension of government power, spreading loyalty from every pulpit. When American agents tried to hand out revolutionary pamphlets, priests publicly burned them. One bishop warned that to join the rebellion would be to invite eternal damnation. Religion, not weapons, kept Quebec in Britain's hands. That religious loyalty was reinforced by cold economics. By 1775, Canada's prosperity ran through British trade routes, not colonial ones. The fur trade, timber exports, and shipping lines were all tied to London's system. Halifax's ports thrived on British contracts. Montreal's merchants relied on British credit. The revolutionaries offered a new republic with no central bank, no stable currency, and no navy. By the end of the revolution, not everyone saw America as a land of freedom. For tens of thousands, it was a nightmare. A place where loyalty to the crown could cost you your home, your business, or your life. These people became known as the Loyalists, and their story explains how the United States' greatest rejection became Canada's greatest inheritance. Between 1783 and 1785, more than 40,000 Loyalists, soldiers, merchants, lawyers, and entire families packed what they could and headed north. They weren't just leaving behind a country. They were escaping a revolution that had turned on them. In towns across the new republic, Loyalists were branded as traitors. Their property was seized under confiscation acts, their names posted publicly, and in some cases, mobs destroyed their homes. Some were tarred and feathered. Others fled with British troops retreating from New York and Boston, clinging to the promise that London would protect them. Britain kept that promise. It offered land, pensions, and supplies to those willing to rebuild north of the border. In Nova Scotia, Quebec, and the sparsely settled Western Territories that would later become Ontario. The migration transformed the population overnight. Halifax and St. John doubled in size within months. Entire Loyalist regiments resettled together, turning wilderness outposts into fortified towns. They brought experience, discipline, and something more dangerous: resentment. These weren't defeated people. They were exiles with a grudge. In British Canada, they built a society defined by everything they believed America had betrayed: hierarchy, loyalty, and faith in empire. The British rewarded them handsomely, issuing land grants and lifetime stipends. To Washington's government, they were British spies. To Canada, they were founders. The irony was clear: America's enemies ended up building its northern neighbor. The propaganda wars that had failed to win Quebec earlier in the war also left deep scars. During the Revolution, American commanders believed they could convince French Canadians to rise against Britain through persuasion. Thousands of pamphlets were printed and dropped over Quebec promising freedom from tyranny and equal brotherhood under liberty. The problem was, the messages were written by men who didn't understand or respect their audience. The leaflets were filled with basic French errors, mistranslations, and religious blunders. Washington's translators were mostly schoolboys from New England. The content wasn't much better. The Americans talked about liberty while keeping slavery intact in their southern colonies. They spoke about tolerance while several of their states still banned Catholic priests. The contradiction was obvious to anyone reading. Quebec's population had just been granted freedom to worship by the British through the Quebec Act of 1774. The Americans were offering rebellion with no guarantee that right would survive. To a deeply Catholic society, the freedom being advertised looked like a trap. Some Quebecers did join the revolution, often merchants or officers hoping for better trade opportunities. But once they crossed into American camps, they found themselves treated as foreigners. Second-class allies at best, expendable tools at worst. Letters from captured Canadian recruits later described contempt from American soldiers and commanders who viewed them as papists and half-loyal. Many deserted and returned north, convinced they'd backed the wrong side. By 1776, the entire propaganda operation had collapsed. Leaflets went unread, recruitment drives failed, and even Franklin's personal diplomacy fell flat. Quebec stayed quiet under British rule, its clergy openly condemning the Southern heresy of rebellion. American hopes of turning Canada into the 14th colony died in the snow, replaced by an unspoken truth: the Revolution's ideals were never meant for everyone. Meanwhile, Britain treated Canada not as a lost province, but as its new stronghold. While the US fought for independence, the Empire poured resources northward: troops, money, and fleets. Halifax became the Royal Navy's command base for the Atlantic. Intelligence networks stretched from Montreal to New York, using fur traders, smugglers, and ship captains to pass information behind enemy lines. The historian Alan Everett once described Canada during the Revolution as a kingdom in waiting. Britain had no intention of losing all of North America. By 1781, spies in New York and Philadelphia were routing reports back to London through Canadian channels. When Yorktown fell and the war ended, Britain may have lost 13 colonies, but it had preserved a loyal fortress just above them. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 confirmed what Washington's generals already knew. Canada would remain British, protected, and strategically positioned as a counterweight to the new republic. For the next century, Britain treated it as an insurance policy, a reminder to America that the empire still had claws on the continent. By the 1790s, Canada had transformed again. It wasn't just a colony anymore, but something uniquely its own, a place defined not by rebellion, but by restraint. The new United States, born from revolution, was already fracturing along political and regional lines. The Whiskey Rebellion, frontier conflicts, and partisan chaos marked its first decades. North of the border, British governors built a different model: order, loyalty, and gradual reform. The contrast became deliberate propaganda. London's colonial office encouraged Canadian leaders to present their society as the calm North, disciplined, loyal, and peaceful, against America's chaotic South, a republic of riots and duels. Newspapers in Quebec City printed stories about American mobs and political assassinations to reinforce the message that stability, not freedom, defined civilization. Loyalists embraced this vision fully. Many saw themselves as the true heirs of English virtue, exiled by a misguided revolution. They built schools, courts, and churches that mimicked Britain's structure. Where the United States chased equality, Canada elevated order. The absence of rebellion became its badge of honor. The clergy continued to preach loyalty from pulpits, merchants thrived under British trade protection, and soldiers kept the borders guarded. Every layer of society had been shaped by the decision not to rebel. That choice hardened into an identity: patient, cautious, quietly proud. While the United States expanded westward through wars and conquests, Canada evolved through negotiation and endurance. It was slow, deliberate, and unglamorous, but it worked. What began as a rejection of revolution turned into something lasting, a culture built on stability instead of upheaval. The revolution gave America independence, but it gave Canada something equally powerful: immunity to it.